Welcome to Ideas Live. My name is Anne-Marie Oomen, and this is my co-host,
Karen Anderson.
And we are the show that has a deep conversation with someone about a topic of real interest to our community or our world. And so we're honored this time. We're doing something a little more unusual. We have with us the director of ReLeaf Michigan for the second time for a part 2 on trees. Our first one was so interesting and seemed both practical and kind of aesthetically important also. And Melinda was so good in expressing the value of trees in quantifiable and qualifiable ways that we decided to have her back because we had more questions and we had more ideas. So in our first part 1, we covered things like the way that trees appreciate property. So there was a quantifiable element to it, but there was also a health element. I mean, weren't you fascinated by the fact that in situations where there's a lot of canopy, there are trees around, that people tend to be healthier? I mean, and what else was there? There were the issues of aesthetics. Of course, we think of aesthetics and trees just constantly, but I think also the idea that, I mean, this just blew my mind. People spend more money on streets and in towns that are tree lined.
Have downtown trees.
Yeah. I mean, I was like, that's strange and wonderful. And
I'm not surprised, really. I mean, there is an aesthetic difference about a downtown that's tree lined. It's more pleasing, and I guess, I mean, I'm not much of a consumer myself, but if it makes the business interests happy and it makes them want to protect trees,
That's right. That's right. But even like, just as an example, if you're having a cup of coffee outdoors, don't you linger longer? Maybe you'd have a croissant too, you know?
Oh, sure. I don't doubt that it's true, but it's fascinating.
Yeah. I think that was, I loved the way Linda linked the science and the aesthetics, or Melinda linked science, aesthetics, and then the practical elements. And that's kind of what we decided to come back to today, was we had both, Karen and I had both read this book, The Hidden Life of Trees. She has the unabridged, I have the abridged with all the pretty pictures. And we had more questions for Melinda, and we feel like this is a relevant topic to spend a little more time on for all of us. So we're going to get Linda back here.
Great.
And see what happens.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Ideas Live. I'm Anne-Marie Oomen, and this is my co-host,
Karen Anderson.
And we're here today. Our deep conversation is very fortunate to have back for part 2 on trees, Melinda Jones, who is director of ReLeaf Michigan and was kind enough to come on last month. And we had a wonderful conversation about the value of trees, how we need to encourage trees, what trees do for our community. It was an amazing thing, and we wanted you to come back and talk more. We felt like that conversation was totally unfinished.
Well, thank you.
So we, in the process of our research, had read this book, The Hidden Life of Trees. And it generated, for both Karen and me, some questions. And it's a little bit, we've talked about this, the book is a little bit controversial because it sort of humanizes trees in a way. And we were both curious about, well, is this real science? You know, is this so? And you have confirmed many of the things that this book claims. So I wanted to start with that, to just talk a little bit about it, because in the book, the claim is that trees speak to each other. And I know from basic biology that trees have a kind of chemistry among each other. But can you talk about how science supports that idea that they, not maybe with words, but that they speak to each other?
Yes. Actually, this is a relatively new science, so there's not a lot that's been done, but it is supported most adamantly by the existence of a symbiotic relationship of fungus with the root systems of trees. And it's felt that that is how the trees actually talk to each other. And the fungus attaches itself to the root tips. And by doing so, the roots pick up nutrients in water, and the nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, and feed it to the root tips, who then, in exchange, provide carbohydrate and sugar, which is what the fungus needs. And the fungus continues to grow, and as the root tips grow and expand, it just forms this mat. And at some point, roots, if they're close enough to each other, will graft into each other. So that happens also.
Roots from separate trees.
Roots from separate trees. Obviously, they like the roots of their own trees better, but they do, if they're in such close proximity, will graft together. And then that allows for, additional communication. But the fungal mass is so very, very important because it's felt that this is how the trees help each other out. So if you have an extremely old tree that has excess sugar to get rid of, carbon to get rid of, then it can defer that sugar to a younger tree or a tree that's in distress. Something like that.
So the big tree is growing here, and the little tree is growing here, and they have a fungal mat between their root systems, and that fungal mat helps the big tree release.
Release the transfer nutrients and water to the younger trees. And it just kind of goes back and forth. It flows back and forth. Now, exactly how the larger trees know that the younger tree is in distress, they're not. That's where the science is still going on. But they've been able to prove that that happens. And they've also used, for example, an evergreen versus a deciduous. So obviously, when the deciduous is absorbing all kinds of water and has excess water, and then you have an evergreen that's probably not doing so well during the summer, it releases the water to the evergreen. Then in the winter, when the deciduous loses its leaves, but you've got the evergreen, it goes back the other way. So it's interesting, but what is interesting, and one of the things is, believe it or not, in Crystal Falls, Michigan, there is a fungal network that has been found to be covers 27 acres, or 37 acres. 37 acres. It weighs 21,000 pounds, and it's been around for 1,500.
This is underground?
Underground, under the city of Crystal Falls.
You're kidding.
No.
Under the city.
Under the city.
And somehow it's surviving.
Yes.
And it's supporting the trees.
Right. It supports everything. And
Remind me, I remember being surprised that because we don't see them, we don't think much about tree roots.
Correct.
Unless they're getting into your sewer system and
Right.
causing issues. But the tree roots are enormous. I mean, don't they go out beyond the canopy?
Absolutely. They go out at least 2 to 3 times past the canopy.
I mean, that's just...
It's amazing. Plus, they tend to be in the top 18 to 24 inches of the soil. So that's why sometimes they become uprooted so much more easily. But yes, the roots are very, very expansive. And that's why it's very important that the root systems get off to a good start. And many times when we plant trees in questionable soil, we add a mycorrhizae, which is the fungus, to the planting hole to kind of get the symbiotic relationship established more quickly.
I love that. And
Let's give you a little fungus.
It kind of reminds us of another point that's made in the Hidden Life book a lot, is that trees are happier when they're with a group. I mean, they're a community, they're social beings, or however we want to think of it. But I didn't know that till I read this book, because I've lived in cities with trees that are kind of spaced out. They're out there on the parkway, or you have a couple in your yard. But they're really happier in a forest. They're happier and healthier in a forest. It makes me feel sad for city trees, but I'm glad they're there.
But you know, that's something I think that's relatively recent information, because when we first bought our property way back in the early 90s, we had a forester look at our woodlot, and at that time she said, well, you could thin these out a little bit. You could, might be healthier if they were like 16 feet apart rather than,
Oh my gosh.
than that 8 to 12 where they were kind of landing at that time. And we considered doing that and decided we would let the forest take its course, mostly because it was daunting to think about tree removal in a woodlot for us, with not being managers of any sort. This book, and now I think several other things, are saying that this was a quote from the book: a tree can only be as strong as the forest, and their well-being depends on their community, and when the supposedly feeble trees disappear, the others lose as well. So this seems to be new science, that they need to be planted closer rather than sparsely. Is that true, or how does that work?
Well, how it works is that the trees, obviously, even in a woodlot, need to have enough space to grow.
Right.
And also in that book, it was reflected about the fact that if you notice, trees don't touch each other. They grow straight up, the branches come out, but if you walk underneath them, very seldom do the ones at the top touch. They just briefly touch each other, and that's all the further that they'll go.
So they don't really go in like interlocking.
Right,
okay.
right. In an optimal condition. Plus, you've got different trees. Some trees are understory trees, and they need the shade of larger trees. So there is that community, that sense of community, and that is one fact that has been shown by science, is that through an urban tree canopy assessment and flying over and using all kinds of data, you can actually get a color photo of a community, and you'll see where the trees which are in a woodlot or a more forested area are brighter green. They're healthier. And as you get away from that to where you've got the individual trees, they're not as healthy, which drives home the point that, no, obviously you need those trees in residential areas, but it's, again, needs to be the right tree, and the spacing needs to be correct. That's very, very important. So generally when we plant trees along streets, is we space them according to their ultimate, how wide they grow. So, you know, if it's this wide, then we'll plant another one so it touches this, if possible, that sort of thing.
So you're trying to encourage the root connection?
Right.
Okay.
The root connection as well as, it looks a lot nicer too. I mean, but you know how far these trees are going to grow, and you don't want them competing with each other.
We lost a big catalpa tree in our backyard a year ago, and we planted a little maple there. And we have a bunch of spruce trees. And the guys that came to look at the maple said, well, you want to trim out this spruce tree here, otherwise the maple's going to get crowded out or whatever. But I called our tree guy, and he's an arborist, and he looked it over and he said, no, he said, the spruce and the maple will be fine. Let them become companions. And I just love that.
Exactly.
Because he said they know how to do this.
They do, and they've been doing
like
it,
you were
which is
saying,
right.
You know? But I think we often tend to just say, oh, we better do this or do this, and maybe we should allow that trees have their own wisdom.
Well, a lot, again, has to do with the purpose of, is it a woodlot? Is it being grown for timber? And obviously they have a different way of, different thought process, and remove a lot of the trees and then leave these, what they call mother trees and that sort of thing. But if you have a regular community forest, then you want to, you know, if something dies, then there's a space that's left, and you need to make sure that this way the branches can grow together and the trees can continue to grow straight up and out.
And cities should, to the extent possible, cherish their little woodlots. I mean, there's one over by Traverse Heights School. There's still kind of a little woods there for the playground. It's so precious. It scares me that someone will see it as an opportunity to build houses. But I mean, here and there, those woodlots seem important. And
well, woodlots are great for children. It's a good opportunity for them to play. Plus the fact the woodlots, encourage animals and insects and things that you're not going to get by walking down a residential street with tree after tree after tree. And so there's a lot of benefit to allowing the woodlots, especially around schools, to just grow.
And just do their thing, I want to go back to the ways in which trees communicate, because there was a really interesting example in The Hidden Life of Trees about the African savanna. Now, we're not there, but I think you have an example of this for us.
Right.
Giraffes feed on acacia trees, and when they come into this acacia grove and they start nibbling on the trees, the first thing the tree does is release a toxic taste into its leaves, so they don't like it anymore and they stop feeding on it. And then it releases a, what do you call it, pheromone?
Pheromone, a scent.
A scent, and that is carried downwind, and the giraffes know if that scent is around that the tree is going to taste lousy. And they won't.
And the other trees will be alerted, aren't the other acacia trees
and
alerted?
it is not just one round. The scent goes down to the trees down that are not being nibbled on.
Right. Yet.
And they release that same toxicity, whatever that is, into their leaves. I wish I knew the science of this better. That fascinated me. That, here is the defense system being olfactory.
And shared.
Yeah.
It's
and shared. And you said there's a similar thing that's happening, only not so positively.
Exactly. Well, one of the other examples that they gave were oaks, and the fact that if a caterpillar starts eating at an oak, that the leaves react and become more bitter tasting. However, with oaks, if an oak, in particular red oak, is cut during prime season when it's in full growth, it will actually immediately release a pheromone that goes out and within 15 minutes will attract picnic beetles, as they're called. And unfortunately, the picnic beetles might have on their feet the fungus, which causes the oak wilt. So that's kind of like an opposite to the acacia tree. So it works both ways.
Yeah. But just the idea that they have these olfactory processes that are operating both for defense and unfortunately making them vulnerable. I think that's just an amazing process.
They're also talking about being able to alert other trees via electrical pulses. Now, I think that's part of science that has a long way to go, but in a way it makes sense also.
The trees have brains. I mean, he talks about that, and if so, where would they be? And he talks about how maybe they have memory, and how do they know when it's actually spring and safe to begin replenishing versus it's just a warm spell in the winter, and how they know, and then it's the amount of light, and can they count? I mean, it's just all of these things are so fascinating to ponder.
Yeah, that was kind of where I was leading, is this whole idea, even though it's not the way we think, that there is a kind of thought going on. Intelligence. And he gave the example of the little plant, the little tiny mimosa plant, that learned that it's one of those plants that closes up if it's alarmed in any way. If anything upsets its environment, it closes up to protect itself. And they were just dropping water on it in a certain way, and it closed up. And then they did it again, and then they did it again. And gradually, this little creature learned that it wasn't to be alarmed, and it retained the information that it could
stop closing up.
Yeah, that it could stop closing up with this particular water droplet. So, I mean, I think that kind of thing calls to question both how little we know and how how there's something larger and maybe more important going on here.
Oh, absolutely. There's been so much research in the last 20 years from when we started out thinking, well, trees are pretty and they absorb, carbon dioxide and release oxygen and all that. And so then we moved into the health benefits to children, and then we moved into stormwater retention. So with every year comes more and more research, and as funding's made available, researchers are able to go further. And so this book and the researchers that he references are truly on a new frontier, which they need to move into, and I give them a lot of credit.
You know, I think that the studies I've been reading recently also about the connection, another of our favorite topics, between water and trees.
Right.
And that where trees exist, the water is cleaner.
Correct.
And there tends to be more of it. It seems to be a purification system. Can you talk a little bit more about that? We didn't talk about that very much the last time.
Sure. Well, if you think of a tree as an umbrella, if you're on the golf course or wherever it starts to rain, you seek out a tree because at least for a while you can stand underneath it and you're not going to get wet because the leaves absorb a lot of it, or they delay the filtration down to the ground. It comes down eventually through the trunk. But as it comes through the trunk into the roots, then the roots start to filter out the toxins, and they get absorbed into the roots, and then the water, which then continues into ultimately our groundwater, is much more clean.
Mm-hmm. What happens to the toxins?
Well, I believe what happens to the toxins is that they are encapsulated within the roots and ultimately within the tree.
And so they just are held,
Right,
sort of like the
held.
carbon dioxide is.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
That's why on a lot of reclaimed sites, there's certain species of trees, exactly which ones, I'm not sure what they use, but they plant those trees because it's been shown that they start absorbing what's in the reclaimed site, and it becomes part of that tree, and it cleans up the ground.
And it doesn't threaten the tree somehow.
It doesn't, but quite frankly, a lot of those trees are very fast-growing trees, and they're used specifically to perform that function.
Okay.
Wow.
And as it gets cleaned up, then you can plant others.
Isn't that, why aren't we doing more of that? Yeah. So that leads to my last question about this particular book. We lost a lot of ash in our woodlot, which many people did in our national forests. Are just an array of those dead trees. I think there were close to 20% in our woodlot because there are big open spaces now, and we have been, as most people do, trying to clean them up a little bit. But in this book, there was this argument for leaving deadwood and how new trees use deadwood to regenerate. And there were discussions of nursing trees and mother trees. And
Right.
Can you address that at all?
Well, as the tree decays, it forms compost, and it's soil, which is much more nurturing to the adjacent trees than probably the regular soil. And plus, it's a great environment for mycelium and the fungus, and you have all
Lots
kinds
of
of different
creatures.
ones, lots of creatures. And so it's really good. But that's not to say to go overboard and
Right.
leave everything. But if it's starting to rot and it's in proximity to a tree, well, it's just adding additional nutrients. And so if you can afford to leave it, then you probably should, because it only has benefit. Plus, animals love it, flowers, whatever. So it serves many purposes.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating too, because
You think even the
you're
expression,
tidying up the forest.
Yes.
What a contradiction.
the expression deadwood is so negative. It's like something you have to clean out.
Yeah.
And we need to rethink how we interpret that.
Right, exactly. So, thank you. So that leads, this show has a kind of two-part element to it. We are aware that right now our city, Traverse City, is considering and developing tree ordinance?
Right.
Because all of these questions that are suggested here suggest that we need to attend to trees differently. And one of the practical ways at the other end of the spectrum that I think we're looking at this is through the tree ordinance. So first of all, can you explain to our viewers and to me, what is a tree ordinance?
Well, a tree ordinance is a structure by which you're going to manage your community forest. So you decide, first of all, I give Traverse City a lot of kudos for actually, I'm sure they had one for a very long time because it's a requirement to be a Tree City USA, and Traverse City's been one for many, many years. So I think what they're doing is they're revisiting it, and they're trying to update it to meet the needs and where they want their city to go. So you have to have a vision for your city, and you have to decide what's of value. You need to look at the makeup of what's your percentage of tree canopy to impervious surface. There's a lot that goes.
Impervious surface being like
concrete,
parking lots. Okay.
Parking lots, yes, items such as that. So then what you do is you say, okay, we know where we want to go. It's important to us that we maintain a canopy cover of 35%. And we want to have a good program that as trees die and need to be replaced, that's in place to do it. So one of the ways that you do that is with a tree ordinance. So it's a good management tool, but it requires a number of things. First of all, it requires you to know what you want to do from a development perspective.
And to gather some kind of consensus.
Absolutely.
It's a contentious issue in some ways.
Yes, absolutely. It's always critical whenever you're introducing something new to get the buy-in of the key stakeholders. So in this case, you have the builders, you have the environmental groups, you have the city, you have the DPW that needs to make all of this happen.
The neighbors.
The neighborhoods. Right, right.
Wow.
So you put that together. Then you determine exactly how it's going to be done, and you start working on when you're developing a site, only X% of trees are going to be removed and they're going to be replaced. And even that you have to think through, because obviously replacing very large size trees with very small trees, you've lost the canopy, at least for a while, until the new trees recover. That's why many times what we'll say in the arboriculture world is that it's as critical that you maintain your older trees as it is to plant new trees, because they're already growing and they're covering the impervious surface, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of elements to a tree ordinance, but someone has to be in charge to make the decisions. Then you have the standards and specifications, which are usually a separate document outside the ordinance, but they're referenced, which comes down to you can't plant a tree within 20 feet of a stop sign. And then you have a list of preferred species that you go on record. And of course, that needs to be done outside the ordinance, because that's a living document. You never know when we're going to get hit with another emerald ash borer. And as other tree issues come up, like for example, pears right now are not a preferred species due to the trellis rust. So you come up with that. Then who is going to enforce it? Who's responsible? What do you do if somebody's going to refuse? And what type of fines and that sort of thing. So it's a very complex document that requires a lot of thought. But communities that are as progressive as far as trees go, like Traverse City, it's critical. And again, I think it says a lot about the city, the planning department, the parks and rec department, that they're thinking ahead as to what tools do they need to manage the overall forest to the benefit of all the residents.
I think it does seem, and maybe you can confirm or question the idea that it seems to me there's more of an awareness among the general public about the value of trees than there used to be.
Right.
For example, there was a big uproar when quite a number of trees were taken out at the airport. And people weren't advised about this, and the reasons were not persuasive in some degree, initially at least. And people were really upset. And I mean, it was sad that we lost trees that perhaps we didn't need to lose, but I was heartened that people got so upset. It was like, oh wow, look at this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that would have happened 20 years ago.
So a tree ordinance might also be a way of raising consciousness?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. And plus, we're just in the information age, the social media age. It's so easy to share articles about the benefits of trees and what's going to happen and why you should think twice about it. And, you know, we talked briefly earlier about even climate change. People are very much aware of climate change, and they're very much aware of the value of trees as one of the many things that needs to be done. So I think it's in front of them.
About the Amazon fires.
Exactly.
Which got people's attention at a level, I think that's fairly unprecedented.
Right.
But it's something, it seems to me that having a tree ordinance and having a consciousness about the value of trees, perhaps driving that ordinance or at least affecting the way we look at that ordinance, it is a way of concretely, practically, immediately addressing those issues of climate change. Because the trees are one way that we can,
right.
10 degrees cooler all of a sudden in an urban area. I mean, doesn't that make sense?
Well, it does. And again, it's a tool. You have a vision, you have an idea of what makes up your community forest, which I know that Traverse City has. They've had an urban tree canopy assessment done. So they know the makeup of the forest. Now they're taking the next step, which is very admirable, and they're updating it to meet current needs.
From the draft, most recent draft, and it's still under discussion, it does seem that there is an effort to be more protective and maybe more proactive about the trees than in the past.
Yeah, it seems, from what I've read, and it gets pretty dense, it's well-intentioned. And I think probably it's the nitty-gritty of the science of it that's...
And also there's a property rights. You know, if I own this piece of property, I can do what I want, including a neighbor of mine who cut down a gorgeous white pine tree because it was dripping sap on his car. And, you know, that I don't want to have to get permission to take a tree out of my yard. And I think those are some of, I mean, you wouldn't think a tree ordinance could cause such controversy, but there's a lot of different aspects to it.
It depends on how far you want to go. It's one thing to say that, no, you can't do something on your property, but it's another thing, for example, in the case of the emerald ash borer, where it really was affecting the entire community. And so that's where you also work in provisions, like in the case of public health. What if you have a tree on your property that's dead and it's leaning over the street, you know, that sort of thing. So you have to be able to do that. But protection is very big, and one of the things is protection during construction. Because I think I am very impressed on that also, because many times, you know, builders have a mission to get something built. And oh yes, there's that tree, but they really don't realize by driving over and over the root systems that you're compacting the soil, and can very much lead to the death of those trees that you thought you were going to save. So you erect, you know, fencing around the outside canopy of the tree and that sort of thing. So there's a lot to it, and I think what we have to keep in mind is that Michigan is right up there with continuing to lose forest over the whole state of Michigan on a yearly basis, and most of it is due to development. So figuring out what to do with development in relationship to trees is absolutely critical.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. And the other issue that kind of surfaced as I was reading it was the question of native versus non-native and invasive versus non-invasive. Because you have said several times from the first show, right tree, right place, right purpose.
Right.
And sometimes we talk about we just want native trees, which I think is admirable, but there's an issue with that, right?
Yes. First of all, not all native trees are the best species for residential areas, especially up here with salt and snow and that sort of thing. So you really want to go with the hardiest species available. Native trees are very admirable, but exactly what is a native tree?
Yeah, that's the other
using
question.
red maple as an example, if you go to a nursery, sometimes it's hard to find a true red maple, because what people want, they want a red maple, but they want it to grow a little bit quicker. So, they've got a subspecies of that. And also, is it native only to Michigan? Was it grown with native seed, or is it okay if it's native to the Great Lakes, or is it native to our planting zone? So there's a whole science, and people need to step back and think about where natives are best used. Are they available? And again, are they the right tree for that situation?
Mm-hmm. And then there's also the question that a native tree isn't, not a native tree could be an invasive tree, and an invasive tree could be I'm confusing that, but the idea is that we have this idea that a native tree is not invasive, when in fact a native tree could be invasive in the right circumstances.
Oh, absolutely.
And that an invasive tree is always bad, and it might be, but I think that we have to be careful with those terms.
Oh, absolutely. And a perfect example are Norway maples. Norway maples are now considered to be invasive. Well, Norway,
Really?
yes, they are. And Norways are invasive if they're close to a woodlot because of the seeds and everything, and they proliferate quite quickly. But sometimes that Norway maple is the perfect tree for somebody's yard, or if you want the Schwedler maple with the greenish purple color, that sort of thing. So that's where you get going with arborists about what should you use and what should you not use. But generally, with an ordinance, it's easier to just say no Norway maples, no pears, no ashes, no buckthorn. So, you can just go on and on and on, but there are other species which are left over. But I always ask people, when we work with communities throughout the state on tree plantings, to be realistic. We will use as much as possible natives, but for example, a lot of people want to use nut trees. Well, nut trees grow very, very slow, and it's they can only be dug at a certain time and planted at a certain time. So there's a whole science. It's not as easy.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. What I was trying to say is that a non-native tree is not necessarily invasive.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that we sometimes forget that in the balance.
Or dangerous or damaging, or might be exactly what we do.
Do tree ordinances address things like, I'm just in general, like when to prune and like seasonal interaction with trees? Do they ever talk about like that? Like it's the best time to prune at this time, or?
They can, and again, that would actually be part of what's called standards and specifications, which is a standalone document which is referenced in the ordinance.
Okay.
And so, yes, they can talk about that. That's many times, obviously, an ordinance addresses utilities, and a tree ordinance addresses utilities. And so that has to be a win-win situation, because people want their power, but yet they want the trees trimmed appropriately and at the right time. So that's another something that has to be worked out. And it can be expanded. Like one of the things that we talked about was oaks right now, and oak wilt. Oak wilt is very prevalent in this area and through northern Michigan, and we all live with lots of oaks. And if we lose all of our oaks, I'm really not sure what we have left, maybe a few maples. So you want to make sure that due to the oak wilt situation, those trees are pruned at the right time. And the right time is the winter, from November until April, or when the temperature is about 40 degrees for about 4 or 5 days in a row. But then there's other times that they can be pruned, but you've got high risk, which would be starting with about mid-April to July 15th, and then you have a lesser risk from July 15th to November, and the least risk, So there are things that you have to do. If you're going to prune, then you're going to paint those cuts. if it's during the high risk.
So a tree ordinance could get that specific.
They could get that specific if they wanted to, yes.
Yeah. But that would, it also seems like then it could be a document for education. You know, it could become a way of educating people like, okay, this is the pruning season for this reason. You know, and that makes perfect sense to me.
Right.
That you don't want to encourage the loss of these trees. You want to nurture them.
Yeah, a lot of that, and yes, and then how much is education and how much, again, whatever you put into an ordinance, you have to be capable of enforcing. And if you do not have the personnel to enforce and, you know, an appeal process and all of that, it can become more complicated. And that's why generally, about as far as I've seen it taken is they don't go so far as specifying when trees should be pruned. Only these are the trees that should be planted, not planted, and sometimes you know, various language related to utilities.
I know, but I have one final question. I just would like to know, in your perspective, if you're working with a community, what is the single most important thing you'd like them to understand about trees?
That trees do make the community. Trees are problem solvers. Trees improve your quality of life. They keep your children healthy. They provide you with better groundwater to drink. So and that trees are part of the infrastructure. You don't just have your sewers and your gray infrastructure, and then you have the trees. They're all part of the overall picture, and going forward, it really behooves every community to think of it as such, as in its entirety, not as little pieces.
Oh, thank you so much.
Wow.
That's really helpful. And we'll be right back with a quick note to finish this off. Welcome back to Ideas Live. I'm Anne-Marie Oomen, and this is
Erin Anderson.
And we just completed the second interview with Melinda Jones, who is director of ReLeaf Michigan, on the subject of trees. And we were working from this book, The Hidden Life of Trees, but then we segued into the question of tree ordinances. And that was fascinating because it seems like a really important, practical, concrete step. Local step that a community can take to nurture and protect and interact with their trees. But you had a final question that we didn't quite get to.
Well, personal relationships with trees. You know, we talk, and Melinda had many, many examples of how beneficial trees are in all kinds of ways to our health and our community and so forth. But they're also friends. I mean, to me, the trees in my yard feel like friends. I mean, they're sentient beings, and this book bears out more sentient maybe than we realized. And when we had to take down this 100-year-old catalpa a year ago, it just about broke my heart. Not just because of the shade, but because it was a presence in my world. So, do you feel that way sometimes?
Oh, I do, absolutely. We have a woodlot, but there are certain trees, I swear, they like it when I'm near. That sounds really spooky, but
it's okay.
I feel like there's a little kinship that happens. And there's a particular tree on my road. It's a big old maple that was at some young age girdled with an iron rope that is that thick, and it was never taken down, and it grew over. It's a scar, and the cord remains in there, wrapping.
The tree has thrived.
But the tree has continued to thrive, and it just amazes me as an example of resilience. And so this is, again, going to sound a little woo-woo, but when I go by that tree, I just send up this gratitude, and it's kind of my hero.
That's a nice way to end.
Thanks for being with us on trees.